project at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. So welcome our panelists, and we'll start with Curtis.
Thanks, Rosalia. Okay, thank you very much, Rosalia. So the theme of this conference is interactions between people within the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire. And there's an interesting chronological overlay that the Russian Empire grows to encompass many new peoples at the end of the 18th and early 19th century. Final partition of Poland, Lithuania is 1795, annexation of the Crimean Khanate, 1783, annexation of the Kingdom of Georgia, 1801, and of course the movement from de jure rule over the Kazakh steppe, at least the Kisha and Orta Juz, to de facto with the steppe statutes of 1822 and 1824. So we have actually a large chronological similarity that many peoples come to experience imperial rule in a new and much more intense, I would say, way at the beginning of the 19th century. And that leads to the question, did peoples who experienced this common, we could call it colonial condition, and in reference to the previous discussion, did people have some impetus to collaborate, to work together, to overturn this imperial condition if they didn't like it, which in many cases what they did not. And my interest comes from particularly the Polish-Lithuanian case. I'm mostly a historian of Eastern Europe, but there is a long-standing myth in Polish consciousness that Polish nobles, in particular Szlachta, and by Szlachta, we mean today people who would be considered Poles, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, or Belarusians, because they all called themselves Poles in the 19th century. And many of the people I study were Ukrainians, actually. Zygmunt Shirakovsky and Mikhail Tchaikovsky both came from Ukraine, spoke Ukrainian. They both had interaction with, for example, Shevchenko, and they both saw themselves as Ukrainians, but they were called Poles by the Russian Imperial administration, and they called themselves Poles too. So these people, I don't want to use the word Pole because it tends to have this ethnic assumption, but we have to use it because there's no better term. These people had some idea that they should try to collaborate with others to overturn their condition. Their main interest was to collaborate with the Circassians, who were leading a series of uprisings against the imperial administration in the 1830s and 1840s. But they had greater ambitions. They had ambitions to work with the Dagestanis and Chechens under the leadership of Imam Shamil, and there was even some thought given to Central Asia. The problem with this is there was a lot of myth-making and a lot of sort of idealizations of what this would entail, and the on-the-ground reality looks rather different. But the most interesting fact that one can find here is that both the Polish-Lithuanian revolutionaries and the Russian imperial administration looked at this situation the same way. They both saw the Poles as troublemakers, as leaders, as people who could inspire anti-imperial agitation. And I think very telling of this is a quotation from the governor of Akmolensk gubernia in 1868. He says, "It would be a bad idea to settle Poles in this area because they might cause trouble, and they might stir up," here's the quotation, "they might exercise a harmful influence on the light-minded Kazakhs and through them spread various opinions harmful to the government." So this was a kind of idea that both Poles and Russians had, that the Poles are the leaders of this anti-imperial agitation. And so this myth that came to exercise a much greater influence on imperial administrators and on the Poles themselves than the reality would actually suggest. In reality, knowledge of Russia's Eurasian frontiers on the part of these Polish-Lithuanian revolutionaries was quite small, and I think sometimes comically so. Can I see the slides, please? Thank you. Okay. So here we have a quotation from Tchaikovsky. Here he is in his Turkish Ottoman garb after he converted to Islam in 1849. But for a while, he was leading a series of revolutionaries based in Istanbul. He said, our agent in the Caucasus should convince Shamil to take leadership over the Carpathians, Tatars, Kazakhs, and other Muslim and pagan peoples. So it's sort of a kind of broad-based assumption of who their possible allies could be without a lot of knowledge on the part of the Poles themselves. So what we end up seeing is that the Polish revolutionaries who claim to be so different from the Russians, claim to be colonial subjects of the Russians, in many ways echo their Russian imperial masters' assumptions, knowledge, and sort of even civilizational mission. Here's one quotation from Zygmunt Cherkasy, also a Ukrainian, by the way. He wrote, the children of great Russians who served for many years in Poland become Poles, but they do not become Tatars in Kazan or Bashkirs in Orenburg. So this he wrote, by the way, to the military governor of St. Petersburg in a pamphlet titled The Polish Question. So this assumption about civilizational superiority was very much ingrained into the ideas of these Polish-Lithuanian revolutionaries as much as of the Russian imperial administrators. All right. Now, we had a large number of exiles in Orenburg and Omsk after 1824. There was supposedly a conspiracy in the Vilnius educational district, which was the center of Polish-Lithuanian culture. In 1824, there was a conspiracy uncovered. A number of people were arrested and sent to Siberia. And of course, by Siberia, we here mean Omsk and Orenburg. This number increased enormously in 1830 after the November insurrection. Large numbers of people were sent to exile in this region. And consciously or not consciously, I haven't figured this out, this served to benefit the imperial administration. They needed people to work in places like the Orenburg Frontier Commission, the Commission for Siberian Kazakhs, as it was called, or Siberian Kyrgyz, as it was actually called. They needed talented officials, literate officials. They needed people who could serve the interests of the empire. And in many cases, Polish exiles became these people. Two in particular, Jan Witkiewicz and Viktor Iwaszkiewicz, both were arrested when they were only 18 and 16 respectively, and they came to Orenburg basically as children, and they supposedly managed to learn what in official documents is called Tatar, but we all understand that that means the local languages of the steppe. And they served in the frontier commissions. They served in some cases as the secretaries of Sultan administrators. Iwaszkiewicz in particular spent years on the steppe as a secretary to a Sultan administrator. But it didn't, the interesting point that I want to come to is that knowledge of foreign culture, knowledge of foreign language doesn't always lead to greater sympathy and understanding. In fact, quite the opposite. The people who learned Kazakh seemed to be the ones who were most interested in fulfilling the imperial mission and in following the empire's goals. On the other hand, people who did learn Kazakh unofficially were suspected by the empire of potential treason. So, for example, there's a case in 1833, a Uniate priest named Zygmunt Sierczyński was arrested, supposedly as part of a wider conspiracy. The military governor of Omsk blamed him for trying to come together in a conspiracy with the Kazakhs, particularly Chingiz Balayev, who was a sultan and father of Shokan Valekhanov, of course. And in the testimony, in the interrogation, they found this Sherechensky's diary. It showed that he had been trying to learn Kazakh, and that piece of evidence was actually damning and one of the reasons that he was executed. Another case, somewhat more famous, Yusuf Herbert escaped into the Kazakh steppe in 1853. He left from the city of Troitsk. And the commander of the Troitsk fortress noted, in 1853, after a 2-day absence, Herbert was found in the steppe among the Kazakhs, and thereafter more than once sought the company of Asiatics. He secretly sought to learn Tatar, and in general was suspected of inappropriate relations with the Kazakhs. So what that means is a little bit unclear, but Herbert himself successfully escaped and supposedly, according to some accounts, made it all the way to Kochand. He became, so far as I can tell, the model of the Polish advisor to Kenessari in Justin Berlin's Kospindeler series, and here he's pictured in the movie, 2016 movie Amanat, about Kenessari and his historian, which is a pretty good movie, I have to say, if you haven't seen it. Anyway, when I saw this movie, I was pretty surprised that there was a Polish guy talking about Kosciuszko in a Kazakh movie. But by the way, Herbert never advised Kenessari. He escaped prison after Kenessari had already died, so it's not a true story, but the model is somehow there. Anyway, these were exceptions, though. The vast majority of people who came to the Kazakh steppe had almost no interest in learning Kazakh, no interest in learning about local customs, and in fact, they tended to create a kind of colonial society, an exile colonial society that was self-referential and solipsistic. That is, it had its own points of reference, its own cultural codes, its own heroes and martyrs that had almost nothing to do with Kazakhs or Russians. So one of the heroes and martyrs, as I talked about at the beginning, was a guy named Michkovsky. He was exiled in the 18th century for participation in the Confederacy of Bar. He ended up staying in the Kazakh steppe. He bought himself a house in Petropavlovsk, lived there his entire life. And in the 1830s, some of his Polish colleagues came to visit. They did a kind of pilgrimage to visit. There was a whole series of rituals involved, and they collected Polish songs from this guy in Petropavlovsk to preserve Polish memory. So almost with no reference whatsoever to their surroundings or the other kinds of people living there. Most of what we know from this period, it has to do with exile literature. There's a very large amount of exile literature in Polish and sometimes written in other European languages, French, English, and German, in order to attract a broader European audience. But this exile literature is designed first and foremost to show that the Russian Empire is an evil empire and that Polish patriots are good people who are suffering unnecessarily at the hands of this cruel empire. One of the ways in which this is done is to show that even if Polish officials had to serve as agents of empire, they did so unwillingly, and they were often nicer than their Russian counterparts. And you probably know Adolf Janos. He has a street named after him here in the city. Very famous, wrote some very famous memoirs of his trip in 1846. And one of his accounts is about his colleague, Viktor Ivashkevich, who I mentioned already, who did learn Kazakh. Supposedly, someone came up to Januszkiewicz and asked about this Ivashkevich. Is he joking? Is he really so kind? This is the first Russian official who doesn't scream, call out, doesn't station Cossacks with whips around his yurt to drive us away. So there's this sort of idea that Polish officials were the good officials. A similar myth revolved around this Osmolowski, who Pavel Shablay mentioned already in his talk, as the good official. So what I wanted to say, though, is that when we look at the accounts, Even though there is this contrast attempt to be drawn, most of the Polish accounts draw heavily from Levshin. So most of the ethnographic knowledge about Kazakhs is really based on Levshin, and they all cite Levshin. And they all say, you should read Levshin. Yanushkovych told his friend Zelinsky, you can't write proper poems about the Kazakh steppe if you don't read Levshin. And at the same time, practically all the accounts I have are mediated through this Levshin, even if the people were and had in fact seen more than Levshin himself saw, which is a point that is often brought up. No one really knows how much he saw, if anything. And so the overwhelming concern of these accounts is more about chronicling the suffering of the Poles and the suffering of the people who were exiled, with very little or limited attention paid to the Kazakhs, who supposedly could be anti-imperial collaborators, but the civilizational assumptions of the Poles is too much, perhaps, to allow this anti-imperial collaboration to really go through. So I need to, I think I'm already needing to wrap up, and I would just say that this image that is created of fighting for our freedom and yours, unfortunately, did not turn out to be as effective. And in most cases, the Polish officials were practically indistinguishable from Russians in terms of their mentality towards and colonial assumptions. Thanks.
Thank you, Curtis, very much. And without wasting time, I will pass the word to our second presenter, Ivan Sablin, who is connecting through Zoom.
So I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to contribute to this fascinating conference. And with my presentation today, we're going to fast forward from what the previous presenter was talking about to the period of the imperial transformation. So we're going to fast forward to the period of imperial transformation and the formation of the imperial parliament. So when we talk about the State Duma, we can kind of get a glimpse into the visualizations of the first two convocations of the imperial parliament and the effect it had in the domestic and international public sphere. So one of the very important things about the State Duma was its diversity in composition. So in that regard, it was similar to, for example, the Ottoman parliament, because it was much more inclusionary if you compare it, for example, to the imperial parliaments of, let's say, France and Great Britain. And unlike the parliaments of the European empires, the Russian parliament and the Ottoman parliaments were inclusive also of groups which, for instance, didn't have the same amount of rights as other groups in the empire. For example, in the case of the Russian Empire, the most obvious example would be the Jewish population, which was also included into the Duma. But on these two pictures that I wanted to kind of start illustrating this diversity with, we can see that at least two different dimensions of diversity were used for the visualization. In the French journal, the first Duma was illustrated with a picture of peasants, right? So you can see on the left side of the Duma, we see many peasants dressed in red shirts, right? And in another colored image, a Lubok popular print image of the first Duma, you can see, if you can see my cursor, you can see that there are also representatives of diverse imperial groups. So most likely the members of the Muslim caucus are shown here. So when we talk about the State Duma, it's important to discuss it not as a mere reflection of imperial diversity, but a site where this diversity was being negotiated and where new categories were being produced. So I mentioned already the Muslim caucus, but there were multiple other caucuses and groups that emerged in the Duma itself. Yes, some of them indeed reflected the dynamics of the First Russian Revolution, but at the same time, some of the groups kind of came together and continued the logic of building new categories already in the Duma itself, right? So for example, we can mention the Siberian group of progressive deputies. Yes, indeed, during the first Russian Revolution, there was some attempt to create a Siberian union, but it wasn't the Duma itself, where kind of the Siberian category, Siberian identification continued to develop very actively in the political sense. But kind of this aspect of the Duma is relatively well researched, right? So there are multiple works about the Duma. Now the literature is over 100 years old. I'm in the field of State Duma studies, and you can find a monograph in many cases, so a dissertation about every ethnically defined group. There are also dissertations about religiously defined groups, about regional groups, and so on. What I want to talk about today in more detail is the production of a synthetic discourse of an imperial community that was also quite important for the Duma. So I'm going to talk about the attempts to create a Russian community, not in the exclusionary sense, so not like the right-wing deputies, the Russian nationalists of the Second Duma were trying to do, but in the inclusionary sense. So in the sense of trying to modernize the Russian Empire and to create a synthesis between a homogeneous national community, so the idea that we could have a horizontal community of citizens, everybody equal and having the same rights, and the idea of imperial difference, and what Jane Burbank called the imperial rights regime. So trying to find a balance between the two, so between the idea of a modern nation, a modern civic nation, and between the empire at a space of diversity where different groups supposedly had different interests and they also had different rights and duties, gave birth to two approaches to inclusionary Russianness. So I termed them integrative and composite. So if we talk about the integrative approach, usually the liberals, so the Constitutional Democratic Party, were the most active proponents of kind of this approach. So the idea that the diverse populations, the diverse groups in the Russian Empire should come together and integrate into a broader civic nation. So Andreas Kappeler argued, for example, that liberals were proponents of an assimilative nationalism. If we look at the materials at the verbatim reports of the First and Second Duma, well, this is not necessarily the case, because so one of the leaders of the Constitutional Democratic Party here, Fyodor Kokoshkin, argued, for example, in the First Duma that that civil equality was indeed important, but at the same time, he and other constitutional democrats didn't insist on cultural assimilation. So if you look at this quote, I won't read it out loud, and if you had a chance to take a look at my draft, you could see that this quote is there as well. But with this quote, I wanted to show you that the discourse in the Duma was very modern. And in fact, you can see that Kokoshkin takes a very clear constructionist approach to nation building, right? So he's not talking about any primordial kind of community, right? He's talking about the necessity to create a nation, right? To create an imperial nation in the legal constitutional sense. So for him, nation building would involve legal equality in the first place. So he is trying to turn kind of the populace into a nation in the constitutional sense. So the integrative approach, as I said, did not necessarily try to eliminate difference, but it stressed the idea of legal equality, right? So legal equality and creation of a horizontal homogeneous community was more important for it than anything else. And of course, if you know this period, Kokoshkin was famously a supporter of broad self-government, decentralization, and autonomies for some territories of the Russian Empire, right? So he was definitely not a supporter of assimilative nationalism. But I find the other approach to inclusionary Russianness, the composite approach, even more interesting because the proponents of the composite approach, they also stressed that all inequality in the sense of limitations on different groups, for example, the Jews, the Poles, has to be eliminated. But at the same time, they also did not necessarily oppose inequality in the affirmative action kind of sense, right? That they imagined a reconstructed empire as a collection of culturally defined units, which would have special autonomous rights. So in this respect, this was a modernization and a continuation of, again, what Jane Burbank called the imperial rights regime. And they campaigned for extending specific rights, additional rights to their constituencies. And this was not necessarily coming only from the multiple caucuses that represented the imperial peripheries. Such an idea that the Russian Empire has to be, the Russian imperial nation has to be a composite community, came also from the politicians from the imperial center, so from other members and leaders of the constitutional democratic party. So I would like mention here specifically, so this person, Nikolai Karataev, who actually gave a very influential speech in the first Duma about the need of a composite understanding of Russianness. So you can see in this quote, I will read part of it because I find this quite important. They say Russia is for the Russians. I understand this, but I understand this only in the sense in which one could say Austria is for the Austrians. So in this regard, he's talking about creation of a civic community which is internally diverse. And then he's talking towards the end of this paragraph about the composite representation in the State Duma, where there are representatives of the Polish people, of the Jewish people, the Tatar people, and so on. So this speech was later repeated by Milyukov in a slightly changed way, where he also talked about kind of this idea of composite nation. And if you are interested, this is the only speech that I know of from the Duma, which was actually recorded. So it's available in YouTube. So you can listen to Milyukov kind of talk through the same points as Karataev did in the first Duma. So among the proponents of this kind of composite approach to Russianness, we can also mention the famous Tatar deputy Maksudov. He also stressed the importance of finding a balance between the Russian language as the state language, as the language of the Duma, and also native languages. So again, kind of this idea was that there would be a composite linguistic community with the Russian language as a medium serving for mediation. So another prominent deputy who represented a very disadvantaged community, so the Jews in the Duma, and was also simultaneously a leader of the constitutional party, Maxim Vinaver, also kind of addressed this issue from a composite perspective. So he is interested not in squeezing and smoothing the originality of individual parts, but in preservation and development of these specificities, right? Finally, the last aspect that I wanted to stop in the presentation today, and of course, as I mentioned in the draft, there is more material, is the combination of class and as an element of difference. And the majority of the members, or at least the most active speakers for the social democratic, so for the most radical left group in the first two Dumas, were deputies from the Caucasus. And at the same time, they saw class as the not kind of the Russian language like Maksudov, or kind of the idea of legal equality as the constitutional democrats, but they saw class as the foundation for the creation of the composite nation. So as you can see here, class could become kind of the foundation of a different type of Russian imperial nation. So here, this idea of aspirational nationalism is very prominent. This is something that for the fourth Duma and for the period of the First World War, Professor Stockdale wrote a book about, right? So the idea that there is not just a need to bring different elements and different territories of the Russian Empire together, but to create a better, more progressive, more inclusive community. And the Social Democrats are just taking it to its logical end in the sense that it has to be a class-based community based on the solidarity of the Anatolian population. And of course, kind of this view of imperial nation building, which would have class as the common denominator, later played a very important role during the 1917 revolution. But of course, during the 1917 revolution, other discourses with the same people being involved featured as well. And there were attempts to create kind of broader Russian imperial nation, but ultimately it gave way to the particularistic articulations. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. And our next speaker is Alen Askar.
So, as already mentioned, my name is Alen Askar. Today, I would like to present some part of my future dissertation that I'm planning to write this year and the next year, and perhaps a bit later. So, just before I start, I would like to make a clarification of main topic of my future dissertation. My dissertation would be called as Khrushchev's Utopia, Virgin Lands Campaign in Kazakhstan. However, I'm still at the initial stages of my dissertation, therefore some things might change. Overall, in my research well, there's an extended historiography on the Virgin Land campaigns in general, and but most of these works are written about history of agriculture, history of the of the communities' deportations, migration, and I wanted to change it a bit to have my own contribution to the topic by exploring the topic of what Khrushchev wanted to make out of this region. What was his plan? What kind of his vision on the creation of the socialist city, or perhaps socialist cry? And in many respects, it is about how the people at that time believed that they were making, what kind of city, what kind of cry, and etc. And the second part of my dissertation, well, future dissertation, would be about what the common people thought, how they perceived this vision of the Khrushchev, whether they had their own opinion, whether they're following these ideas or not, and etc. However, for this exact presentation, I would like to talk about the community of people, primarily the journalists. Thank you. The journalists who decided to migrate to the Kazakhstan and to write about history. I had the two main sources of the information. The first one is the presidential archive in Almaty, and in the future I'm planning to extend my archival work in Kokshetau and possibly in Moscow. And the second type of the primary sources is the memoirs of the journalist who participated on the Virgin Land campaign, in particular Louisa Svitic, who is the she in 2017 published an extended memoirs of her own, and also the collections of the she collected the memoirs of the known journalists with whom she worked for 9 years in Telemachu. Currently, she teaches at MGU, Moscow State University, and the Faculty of the Journalism. She published 65 books and etc. But primarily, I'm just interested of how she presenting what she thought was happening during the Virgin Land campaigns and the role of the journalist in all of that. So I would like to start from the explaining who were those journalists. The majority of those people who decided to migrate to the Telemachu, they were the young people who just recently were graduated from the universities. Most of them were graduates of the Moscow, St. Petersburg, but more in general, they are graduates of the Russian and Ukrainian universities. Also, Mikhail Paul points that most of them those intelligentsia who decided to migrate, they were quite optimistic about all of this, all about this Khrushchev's relaxation of the censorship, relaxation of the political persecutions, and many of them were young enthusiasts. And as soon as they started to migrate, one of the first destinations to work was Akmolinskaya Pravda. Later, also some of them decided, even the Russians worked in Turkestan too, and more globally they were working in the regional newspapers and etc. However, the big change starts from 1961 with the changing of the region administrative divisions when the Khrushchev announced that there would be Akmolinsky Krai, and because as soon as he declared that, in Tselenograd there appeared 3 new newspapers. It is Tseliny Krai, Молодой Tselinnik, and Tun Olkese. Okay, as I've been mentioned, most of these people were quite optimistic. They were motivated to go there. They were motivated to write their own stories. Most of them shared the vision of the Khrushchev of building the socialism, communism within matters of the first decade. However, among them, there were a few journalists who points from the memoirs that one of the reasons why they decided to migrate to the Tselenograd is because of the Algiers, that many of the mothers, grandmothers, or other relatives were residing in Algiers, and it was one of the reasons why they decided, particularly into the Tselenograd, which is kind of interesting. The journalists of the Tseliny Krai is usually where those journalists who decided to migrate through the quota system, that they were called to come here. Usually those journalists had prior experience. They were taken by the party to the Tselenograd. As you can see from the picture, most of them were in their 30s and 40s. So it is compared to the Молодой Tselinnik newspapers, which primarily was composed of the Komsomol, and most of them were just recent graduates of the journalistic faculties in Moscow and Leningrad. For many of them, it was the first job, and perhaps they were like the most driving, the most active journalists of the time. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the picture for the Tun Olkese, the members of them, but in the future I will also write about them. For the young journalists without prior experience, most of them, they were writing the materials for the newspapers that you can see from the picture. It was usually the short text explaining the heroic acts of the workers on Tselina, of those people who are working in sovkhozes, working in industries, mechanizators, and etc. And I encountered the very interesting details from the speech that she remembers, saying that usually those young journalists were supposed to create at least two texts per newspaper issue. The first one is their reports under their own names. However, at the same time, they were also producing the like written letter to the newspaper as if it was written by some workers from sovkhoz or from the factory or somewhere from the mechanizators. She explains that it happened because at the beginning, when the newspapers were just created, there was simply not enough materials to write, and etc. However, I didn't feel that she was against it. In fact, I thought, I get a sense that while she writing that, she was quite optimistic about it. And later she explains this, that it was a good thing, because often when those reporters go to the villages, the people come to them and complaining to them about their administration, about their conditions, how they live, that they do not have enough housing, apartments, not enough water. But eventually those workers do not want to write to the newspapers themselves. And such a creation of the pseudonyms and the journalists writing about, like as if they're writing from the sovkhoz workers, allowed the journalists to, in many respects, protect the rights of these workers, because this way they are ensured that nobody would be persecuted, nobody really knows that such a person exists, and in many respects, such way the journalists trying to improve conditions of the workers. Regarding the censorship, by 1961, for the whole Kazakhstan, there was a 92.5 official positions for the censor, as the censors and the administration for the censorship in Kazakhstan, which is quite low number. 26 of these positions were located only in Almaty, meaning that 60 positions of the censors were located for the rest of the Kazakhstan oblast, for the whole oblast newspapers, rayon newspapers, village newspapers, and etc. Overall, they were extremely overburdened with the texts. The censors in Almaty were supposed to read at least 1,200 pages a day. It overall shows that the censors had it was limited. They had limited amount of censors, and also that each oblast had very few such censors, and the primary sources suggest that the more local the newspapers was, the less likely it was checked by the censors. The administration by the 1961 is saying that it is the report by, I think, by the propaganda members that in 1961, there was 256 newspapers that were completely not checked by the censors, meaning that, well, there was no control of that. And overall, I would say that the journalists in the Selina campaign were not really checked. They were not really censored compared to the Republican newspapers and the Republican journalists. And it allowed the journalists in the Selina campaign to become relevant, to become powerful, and in many respects, with each year, they become popular among the people. People start writing them actively, and they became that such intermediaries between the common people, common workers, and authorities on the Republican level, on the rayon level, and also the old Soviet level. Usually, when the workers were, of course, members were writing the complaints, they usually duplicated the same complaints to the newspaper, so that, and often they would also, in their complaint letters to the authorities, they'll indicate that this letter was copied to the newspaper Pravda or newspaper Молодой Целинник, and etc. And I think it indicates that the journalists in the Celina campaign became like fourth estate. They become powerful, and they will become protectors of the rights of the common workers. And they were often openly criticizing the administration. And also, in memoirs of Svicic, she argues that in many respects they became the authorities became accountable for the journalists, because as soon as they publish some kind of criticism, the journalism, usually the authorities try to respond in a matter of 2 or 3 days to these accounts, to the newsletters, and etc. The very funny thing happened in 1961, because, well, as soon as there was a first issue of the Молодой Целинник, Adolf Dichtar, one of the journalists, published a criticism of the conditions of the mechanical workers in the Celina campaign, that they usually had nothing to do in their free time, that their condition of the housing is poor, and it was published in the first, with the first issue of the Молодой Целинник on the page 3. And as soon as, well, censors responded to this after the newspapers was already published, and it was the usual case when the censors are finding out about this quite late. And the thing is that newspapers was only about to present to Khrushchev himself, who visited the Tselinograd. And the censors were quite angry at this, and he was supposed to get rid of the issue of this faculty. But the next day, the Khrushchev was, while he was giving a speech in Tselinograd, he cited this Adolf Dichtar's criticism, and after that, the censor Osipov asked the forgiveness, apologized to journalist Dichtar, and said that it is a good thing that he included the criticism on page 3. Also, I'm calling the historians not to treat the journalists as the passive actors, which were only trying to follow the Communist Party directives. It was not the case in case of journalists in the Celina campaign, because as the citizens of this city, they were also experiencing the same problems as the other people. And one of these problems was that during the spring, the Tselinograd was usually like transforming into the city full of mud, full of dust, and etc. And journalists were not also not happy with this. And one of the journalists, Nina Kristova, who was just recently, well, in 1960, graduated the university in Moscow. She was hired as a journalist to the Молодой Целинник, and she, well, decided to change things, and she created the small newspapers, which was very short, and I don't know whether it was just one issue or more, I couldn't find it yet, in which they, well, in many respects, created the first urbanistic newspapers for in Kazakhstan, where they discussed the problems of the city Tselinograd, that they were, she called all the journalists in the Krai to write their suggestions, how to improve the city, and in my respect, the authorities started to respond to these newspapers slowly months after that. And after that, these newspapers created a discourse of making the city green and clean. And also she, through the newspapers, were able to convince authorities that there is a need to create the dendra parks and overall to make the city green. Okay, my conclusion. So in my perspective, the new intellectuals, which were quite optimistic with the Khrushchev's ottipel, truly tried to create their own world, tried to change the city and Krai, and the freedom that they had compared to the Republican newspapers allowed them to criticize the authorities, to give their own suggestions, to become the protectors of the workers and the kolkhoz and sovkhoz workers, and etc. And therefore, I think their importance and that they were influential in the building of the new Khrushchev utopia. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Alen. This is a very exciting research, so good luck in the continuation of it. And our last presenter is Gulmira Sultangalieva, and the floor is yours.
Уважаемые гости, участники конференции, разрешите представить свой доклад. Бакытжан Каратаев о политике Российской империи в Казахской степи. Бакытжан Бисалевич Каратаев, праправнук хана младшего Жуза Абулхаира, он больше известен, изучается в исторической науке как политический деятель, как депутат Государственной Думы, но менее чем как исследователь. Хотя на самом деле его судьба – это отражение диапазона всех тех возможностей, которые предоставило ему его историческое время, и всех тех изменений, которые испытала казахская степь в процессе интеграции в состав Российской империи, а затем Советского Союза. Выпускник Оренбургской мужской гимназии, юридического факультета, позже юридического факультета Санкт-Петербургского университета, который он закончил золотой медалью. И как представитель второй генерации казахской интеллигенции он считал важным распространение верных и точных сведений о казахской степи, обозначил горячо любимую им родину, как он написал, горячо любимую им родину в своей статье о Тургайской газете, как Киргизляндия, и написал работы, которые хранятся в фондах Центрального государственного архива. На самом деле, это можно следующий, да, вот я как раз... Он сейчас работает, да? Да, посередине. Это на какую? Ага. Да, я сейчас попозже, но я вот рукописное наследие Каратаева, я представила только часть из них. Естественно, что в фондах еще есть, и я буду из этих представленных работ его только обсуждать две, и я буду обозначивать эти работы. Но вот история революционного движения, сообщение из Новой Сенаки, я буду говорить об этом, история революционного движения находится в фонде исторического музея Западно-Казахстанской области, когда я была там в командировке, нашла. И я буду вторую работу говорить, обзор материалов. И краткий очерк «История Алашарды». Это вот Дина Ахмеджановна Аманжолова, наш профессор из Москвы, она вот дала мне этот материал. Тоже очень интересный. И я думаю, что на самом деле у нас наша задача вот осмысление того рукописного наследия, которое оставил нам Бакытжан Каратаев, и нужно ввести их в научный оборот. Начало его научных изысканий началось после завершения обучения в 1890 году в Санкт-Петербургского университета, и он получил распределение на должность помощника мирового судьи в село Новосенак Кутаисской области. И здесь вот эта тенденция проявилась в том, что, находясь на юго-западе Закавказья, Бакытжан Каратаев стал сотрудничать с обществом археологии, истории, этнографии при Казанском университете. И свидетельством этого явилось то, что в 1895 году он обозначен как член-сотрудник этого общества. И, соответственно, он написал свою статью в Тургайской газете, и вот мною было это обнаружено год назад в Тургайской газете. И вот здесь он пишет о том, что, живя на другом конце Азии, с вершин Кавказа, считал важным поддержать начинание Тургайской газеты, которая из номера в номер публиковала статьи по истории и культуре казахского народа. И он считал, что, начиная свое рассуждение, свою статью в Тургайской газете положение о распространении образования среди казахских женщин, он поднял вопрос о положении женщины в казахском обществе и необходимости изменения сложившейся ситуации. Когда женщина продолжала, по его мнению, оставаться в конце XIX века, вот здесь вот в Кутаиси я представила с грузинской семьей, со своей семьей. И вот здесь вот положение женщин в степи я очень кратко пройду, потому что я боюсь, чтобы у меня хватило времени. И здесь очень важно, что поднял вопрос о том, что в конце XIX века, несмотря на то, что время изменилось и находится в составе Российской империи, на самом деле это русские законы уже функционируют на территории Казахской степи, но женщина оставалась вещью, объектом купли-продажи собственности мужа. И он, как через обычаи казахского кочевого общества, он пытался понять, соотнести историческое прошлое с современной ему действительностью, конец XIX века, и он пишет о том, что изменилось историческое время, и, соответственно, должны были измениться отношение к женщине, к семье и образованию. И как дипломированный юрист он понимал, что только законодательным путем можно изменить систему семейных отношений в степи. И он рассмотрел два вот эти обычая, это полигамия и либерат, которые отражают женскую безличность и бесправность. Это вот его слова. Он считал, что полигамия, которая существовала в конце XIX века, это обычай многоженства, да, был создан период, когда гражданские правоотношения регулировались силой и путем организованного самоуправства. Но сейчас, когда полигамия по этому кочевому обществу была вызвана лишь в целях защиты личных имущественных интересов против насилия и с целью создания многочисленного потомства. И поэтому, находясь в составе Российской империи, естественно, когда имущественно-личные интересы, он пишет, стали регулироваться русскими законами, то и нет надобности сохранения у казахов института полигамии. Второе – это ливерат, это порядок наследования, да, женщины родственниками умершего мужа возник тоже как институт опеки и попечительства, учреждаемый над вдовой и имуществом умершего хана, умершего члена семьи. И для того, чтобы сохранить капитал, который имеется в семье, и сохранить не только в семье, но и для рода этот капитал. Поэтому этот либерат, он считает, что превратился первоначально это противоестественное зло. И он предложил несколько моментов, чтобы изменить вот эту ситуацию. Вот здесь вот установление предельного возраста выдачи казахской девушки замуж, да, признание законодательным путем гражданских прав, женщины и дееспособность предоставления ей права частной собственности на движимое и недвижимое имущество мужа и родителей. И вот здесь вот последнее – это распространение образования среди казахских женщин, он считал это очень важным, и он там приветствовал открытие гимназии, это школы, и он участвовал в открытии первой школы в Иргизе с Аль-Мухаммедом Сейдалиным и Ибрагим Алтынцариным. И про гимназии. И это он считал, что почему только через женщина, которая занимается постоянно воспитанием своего ребенка, только через ее образованную женщину может прийти культура в семью. Это вот, конечно, немножко не касается моей темы, но я считала это очень важным. Это первая статья, вероятно всего после завершения его обучения, учебы в университете, и поэтому здесь вот он как дипломированный юрист выступил и предложил изменение, законодательно изменение положения женщины в степи. Второй, это очень важный момент, конечно, это его работа, обзор материалов обзор материалов из истории колонизации Казахского края в связи с восстанием казахов Оренбургского края в 1869 году, начало 1870-х годов. Эта работа написана примерно в 30-х годах 20 века. И машинописная рукопись состоит из 276 листов. Она была сдана в фонд редких книг и рукописей Национальной библиотеки РК, супруга Каратаева после его смерти в 1934 году. И в 2006 году она была издана впервые в Актубе доцентом Абеновой. Бакытжан Каратаев при написании своей работы, это считается как научная работа, он опирался на архивные документы, извлеченные из фондов Центрального государственного архива, на историческую литературу, Левшина, Середа, Добросмысла, он их относит как либералов, исследователей, придерживающие либеральное направление. И здесь вот подбор вот этих документов, которые, и здесь я написала информанты, у него были казахи, да, о событиях конца 60-х годов 19 века. Примерно это к 30-м годам, это были в возрасте уже 50-60, но там 18-летний, он говорит, в этот период ему было 18 лет и так далее, он собирал эти воспоминания. И личные воспоминания самого Бакытжана Каратаева. То есть вот тот подбор документов и литературы отражает его как лабораторию исследователя Бакытжана Каратаева, его инструментарий, умение сопоставить исторические документы с реальными событиями, которые происходили в 60-х годах 19 века. Не случайно его работа обозначена как история русской колонизации, ибо объектом исследований Каратаев выделил политику российской власти с середины 60-х годов, и по его мнению только в это время началась систематическая колонизация казахских областей. Работа охватывает 10 лет, 1865-1875 год. И мы знаем, что по реформе 1869 года мы имеем очень ряд работ по административной, это Салыкзиманова, Бану Мажитна Абдрахмановой, да, Жиренчина и так далее, защитные диссертации. Но в этом ряду исследование Каратаева занимает особое место, потому что он являлся сам свидетелем событий, происходивших во второй половине 19 века, лично знал многих казахских деятелей, семья Султанова Арслана, Курмановых, включил здесь, вот я сказал, что воспоминания участников восстания 69 года. Его в историческом сочинении это отражается восприятие султанами и рядовыми кочевниками нового законопроекта, процесс внедрения данной реформы и отторжения основных положений реформы казахами. Я хочу здесь вот выделила основные аспекты, что нового он включил, в отличие от современных работ. Во-первых, будучи о статусе сословий султанов, будучи чингизитом, Каратаев особо выделил сословие казахских султанов и рассмотрел процесс эволюции их статуса. Мы знаем, что в первой половине 19 века шел процесс размывания статуса султанов. Да, это законодательные документы 1855, 61, 65 годов. Но вместе с тем Левшин считал, и что здесь он очень привел документ, что Левшин считал, что султаны – это оружие в распоряжении русского правительства, и подчеркнул, что султаны восприимчивее к образованию и готовы служить правительству. И Каратаев подчеркивал, что тактика русской власти в 60-х годах 19 века была направлена на нивелирование, дальнейшее нивелирование статуса и влияния султанов, не только потому, что они были отстранены от среднего звена управления, но и потому, что региональные власти видели в них реальную угрозу по внедрению нового законодательного документа. И здесь вот новое, что он привел в тексте рукописи есть проект о выселении всех султанов с их семьями из степи и поселениями их в России на отведенных участках. Этот проект, по его мнению, был разработан военным губернатором Уральской области Григорием Голицыным. Но, однако, этот проект обсуждался, и против идеи данного проекта выступил военный губернатор Тургайской области, это Гейнс, да, который считал, что султаны не пользуются особыми правами и преимуществами по сравнению с другими, и поэтому они безвредны для правительства. Но сам факт удаления султанов из степи, он пишет, что этим самым бы они освободились от опасного бунтарского материала в случае каких-либо внешних или внутренних осложнений. Этот проект также не был, пишет Каратаев, что не был поддержан Крыжановским, и, видимо, по его мнению, этот проект застрял в земском отделе Министерства внутренних дел, и поэтому, если мы будем смотреть, фонд 1291, возможно, мы найдем, но я этот проект не видела. Каратаев считает, что эти проекты региональной администрации против султанов не имели основания и исходили из незнания чиновниками роли султанов в казахском обществе. Во-первых, сейчас А вот здесь султаны, он выделил 3 категории султанов. Султаны, которые смогли адаптироваться к нововведениям русской власти. И это султаны Байгуши, он тоже считает, которые пасли скот в качестве наемных. И султаны, которые получили русское образование, продвигались по служебной лестнице. Каратаев, следующий это аспект, вы знаете, что положение есть политика русификации, христианизации. И он считает, что мусульманизация, которая вот пропагандировало, да, российское правительство о том, что идет мусульманизация казахов татарами, на самом деле, он говорит, этого не было, и он очень хороший процесс приводит доводы, что ведь в 1931 году, когда присягу принимали у Абул-Хаир-хана и последующие годы, это принимали в присутствии муллы и на Аль-Коране. Поэтому здесь что это более чем невежественная и неудачная мысль. И здесь, наоборот, что в процессе противовес мусульманизации начался процесс вытеснения ислама, ограничения количества мул мечети в волости, изъятия духовных дел казахов и так далее. Здесь о земле и землепользовании, здесь он, когда у него, вы знаете, прекрасные речи с трибуны Государственной Думы, и как юрист он очень четко понимал, что здесь Российская империя использовала вопрос сознательного непонимания или отсутствия вообще понимания кочевой жизни казахов. И основная идея вот этого землепользования – это разрушение родового начала, и с землей связан вопрос создания территориально-административной структуры. И вот он пишет о том, что это искусственное стремление правительства к разрушению сложившегося уклада на основе родового начала. Это продуманный расчет, это положено начало деформации власти в традиционном казахском обществе, представленной обеими. И здесь методы региональной администрации, но здесь понятно, что используется, но где у него очень детально описано честолюбие, как используется российская администрация для того, чтобы выдвигать тех или иных лиц. И он там и фамилии, и имена приводит, которые получили должности волостных, аульных старшин там, и так далее. Он очень, здесь еще такой очень новый момент, раскол кочевого общества, потому что основная масса, которые выступили против внедрения, это были казахи Оренбургского ведомства и казахи Западно-Сибирского ведомства. В этот же момент отправляли благодарственные письма на имя оренбургского генерал-губернатора в связи с созданием властей. И он говорит, да, и причиной этого, он считает, что причиной вот этого раскола это разница в управлении Западно-Сибирского и Оренбургского генерал-губернаторства. И самая важная причина, то, что на территории Западно-Сибирского генерал-губернаторства раньше возникли стационарные пункты, и поэтому фактически они уже были адаптированы к той системе, которую пытались создать, которую создавали в 60-х годах 19 века. Ну, здесь вот это с фонда музея Западно-Казахстанской области. Я хотела фотографию, да, представить. Таким образом, что самый главный, очень важный момент – это выводы быстренько я скажу.
Хорошо, я как раз хотела попросить вас перейти к выводу.
Да. То есть исследование на Каратаева позволяет нам взглянуть на события Казахской степи конца 60-х годов как бы изнутри. Ему удалось реконструировать фактически эти события и передать умонастроение народных масс, имена которых часто оставались нам неизвестными. Им приведены и собственные оценки отдельных событий, о которых знал это, и лиц, которых он знал лично. Важно то, что Каратаев показал, как формировался процесс исторической памяти казахского народа спустя 60-70 лет. И через эти воспоминания Каратаев пытался отразить вот, на самом деле историческое мышление казахского народа. Ну, спасибо за внимание.
Спасибо большое всем участникам секции. И теперь мы попросим Келли О'Нейл поделиться своими доводами, своими замечаниями.
Thank you so much. Thank you for really rich and interesting papers. A few of them are connected to each other in very clear ways, and a couple relate in different ones, and I'll try to see what I can do to draw those connections out. The panel is called Boundaries and Belonging. These are kind of buzzwords in the field of history and have been for a while now, particularly the idea of boundaries. And when we talk about boundaries, oftentimes we'll preface the word boundary with an adjective that makes it sound even more exciting, right, than the concept of a boundary could be. Contested boundaries, right? Discursive boundaries, imagined boundaries, right? What I think the papers in this panel do is suggest that we think particularly about the inescapability of boundaries. If you think back to the four stories that you have just heard over the last few minutes, you will see that your attention has been drawn to a multiplicity of boundaries that belong to a category that we don't usually pay as much attention to. When we think about boundaries as historians, our attention is often drawn to the most obvious boundaries, the most stable boundaries, the ones that are legitimated and legislated and documented, the ones that are discussed at the highest level of politics and translated into lines on a map. And we can all point to them and say, here is the boundary, right? And then we can problematize it and contest it and think about it in complicated ways. But there are certain boundaries that tend to draw our attention more than others. These papers draw our attention to some less stable boundaries and to some of the lines that we don't usually think too much about. They lead us to question what it means to be on the inside of a line and on the outside of a line. What's really interesting about each of these papers is that that they find interesting ways to explore the moment in the middle, right? The moment where the line isn't yet drawn. It hasn't been successfully drawn at all. No one's sure where the line is going to go. No one's sure where the boundary is, and they don't know if they want to be on that one side of it or the other side of it. Right. So these are papers that address these moments of instability in the way that people are thinking about community over a long 19th century, essentially. There are, of course, some very familiar categories of boundaries at play, boundaries that relate to citizenship, political communities, ethnicity, generational divides. There are created boundaries here and ascribed boundaries, inherited boundaries, boundaries between what is legal and illegal, boundaries between what can be known and cannot be known, what can be published in papers, in journals, newspapers, and what cannot. So I think one of the really interesting things that the panel does for us is push us to think about the dynamics of belonging, and to really get us thinking about the moments when these boundaries, the moment before they have been drawn or named or crossed. So let me just say a couple of things, and I also want to acknowledge the fact that it is the last panel on a wonderful and very intensive, intellectually intensive day. So I'm going to keep my comments quite short, and that is not because these papers aren't incredibly thought-provoking, but I want us to have a chance to discuss them. And I know that it's just hard to listen at the end of the day as well. So, and you want to save a little bit of intellectual appetite for what's coming after this panel as well. So just a few thoughts about each of the papers. The first one is Curtis Murphy's paper. And here we have kind of a decentering of the story of Polish identity, right? Our Polish exiles and kind of voluntary civil servants have been displaced from their own kind of Polish territory and put into a completely different geographic and cultural context, which makes for a very interesting story about how Russians and Poles and Kazakhs are triangulating and trying to, or not trying to, figure out and delimit the boundaries between one another. In his paper, in his talk, Curtis shows us a very wide range of strategies used by the Poles to navigate the imperial system, or sometimes simply to not engage with it. So we have descriptions of engagement with civil service, marriage, the acquisition of expertise, inappropriate behavior of one kind or another. And one of the things that I would love to hear you talk about a little bit more, Curtis, if you feel up to it, would be to talk about how thinking about the Polish perspective, whereas it's located in the steppe, how that brings up some interesting questions about kind of the deterritorialization of Polish identity, if it ever was territorialized at all. I'm wondering how the Poles are thinking. You've shown us how they're thinking about all kinds of things, but I'm wondering how they were thinking about the steppe itself. And I'm wondering how they're thinking about the territory that they're inhabiting for sometimes short amounts of time, sometimes for a decade. So do they talk about it? And if they do, does it change the way they talk about Polishness, right? So does being outside of that space have that kind of territorial displacement? Does it play any role in how they see themselves and their sense of belonging either to the Polish identity or to a larger imperial identity, as you like? And I have also a rather crazy question that I would like to pose to you as well, because it was just so tempting. You showed us how Russians sometimes in these stories are looking at the Poles and the Kazakhs and seeing birds of a feather. These two belong together. They're troublemakers, right? And we see the Poles kind of looking out and deciding, well, they really don't want to be Russian, right? They'd rather just be Shlachta. They don't want to be Russian nobles, and they also don't want to be Kazakhs. So that's how they see things. And then you also, at one point, mentioned that the Kazakhs, when they look out, don't see a substantive difference between the Poles and the Russians, right? Sometimes there's a kind Pole, and that's wonderful, but they're really not convinced that it's a substantial difference. And that leads me to ask my crazy question, which is, would it be possible to kind of paint the picture of the social landscape of the Russian Empire from the Kazakh perspective, right? We're always thinking about how the Russians see their empire. And sometimes we do actually talk about how the Poles see their empire. We ought to be changing our perspective, right? Decentering our perspective on how all of these categories are drawn. And I'm just wondering if, I know it's not the focus of your research, but if there's a bit more of that Kazakh perspective on kind of imperial structures that you might want to say something about. Ivan, who I know you're there. This was such an interesting and wonderful paper where he is setting out, addressing what is described by the actors in his story as the paradox between implied homogeneity and inherent heterogeneity, right? So this project in 1905, 1907 is to figure out how to square that circle, how to deal with that paradox. And he describes these ideas of integrative and composite kind of citizenship that are motivating these discussions. There's so much to say, but I want to boil it down to just maybe two questions for you, Ivan. One being, is there something in the paper in particular, you give a lot of, it's almost like you're bringing us through the hallways and we're overhearing the conversations as they're going on. There are so many voices that you bring into the story. There are so many voices who are participating in this conversation about how the political community should be defined. Is there something in the way that discourse developed that was unique to the way that political discourse was at the time? This question of what this political community should consist of. Did people talk about it differently? Did ideas flow through different channels than they did when they were talking about other kind of reform projects at this time? Or is this just one of many questions that was on everyone's agenda, and it's just the topic that is different? So this is just a question about kind of the medium and the way that these things get developed. And my other question for you comes from the panel that we had this morning, the first panel this morning, and we had the discussion about boundaries and how they're developed, how they're defined. And Terry Martin had said, well, it's interesting to think about the idea that the boundary has to be drawn before the ideas can come from it, right? So you draw the territorial boundary and then people start figuring out what nationality means. But without the boundary being there, it's really hard to do. In your case, is one of the problems or the difficulties, the challenges in solving this paradox for your actors, that they actually need to draw that boundary before they can figure out what this Russian political community can actually be, right? It's kind of a cart and a horse kind of question. And that's one of the reasons perhaps that they can't resolve it in that moment. Alen, Askar, so we have a story here. This is a fast forward into the Khrushchev era. And here we have other kinds of perspectives on the question of belonging, the kind of arrival of new voices and new actors in a scene, onto the scene, people who are able to immediately leverage their expertise and skill to kind of create new interest groups, right, in this space. They're really good. They seem really good at navigating the problem of censorship. There's a lot of creative power that is being exercised here. And I'm wondering if you could maybe say a little bit about the idea of belonging as it was experienced by the journalists, right? In a sense, the journalist is there to observe and to report, but not necessarily to belong. It isn't an essential part of their job. But I would love to know how they feel about their relationship with these communities, how embedded they are, and whether or not they feel like they're crossing boundaries in doing their work. And finally, for Gulmira, we have kind of interested. It's hard to know whether I want to ask you questions about the 1860s and 70s, the questions that Karataev himself is interested in, or if I want to ask you questions about Karataev, right? Because you have kind of two stories going in your paper: the development of Karataev as a historian, and the really novel perspective that he's bringing to how we understand questions of boundaries and belonging on the steppe. There are, sorry, let me flip to my, so you bring us through some of the really key moments that he points to in this history that really show us how Kazakhs are kind of destabilizing the idea of imperial boundaries here. You tell us in the paper about the idea to forcibly resettle, and you talked about it here, forcibly resettle the sultans and their families from the steppe, which is a policy that's then opposed, right, by the governor general, and doesn't actually come to fruition. It's one of many cases where there's an idea of how to deal with the problem of the steppe that's elaborated by imperial officials that then isn't implemented or doesn't have the desired effect. And another example that you gave actually in the paper, but not here, you described the policy in the temporary provision on the steppe to limit the number of mullahs and mosques, right, that were allowed in this territory to one per volast. And this is just another example of kind of a boundary setting in Islamic space, or an attempt at it by imperial officials that, as you point out, and as Karataev point out, it didn't have the desired effect. And had the opposite effect, it turns out. And one of the reasons why the imperial policy didn't work was that they didn't understand nomadic spatial practices terribly well. They didn't understand that the Kazakhs didn't have daily access to their mullahs and to their mosques, and that there was a seasonality to the way that they practiced their faith as well. So there's a boundary of knowledge. There is an inability on the part of the imperial state to craft policy and implement policy that perpetuates the kinds of boundaries that they want to. And Karataev exposes that in the work, the very kind of unique work that he does on Kazakh history. I'm wondering if you could just, my one question for you is maybe you could tell us a little bit about your sense of him as a historian. He is not only working with materials, archival materials, as you point out, he was an interlocutor with these people. He knew he was there, he was connected, not only to the spaces, but to the actors. And so in a way, he becomes a historian who's crossing disciplinary boundaries between history and anthropology, although he's not thinking of it that way. But he's practicing Kazakh history in a way that we can't now. We can't go back and write about the 1860s in the way that he could. And I'm curious how you think of him as a historian and the kinds of stories that he tells and the ways that he deals with his access level of a level of access to these communities. He's in a way unbounded in a way that most other people in these stories are not. So many different actors in play. One of the wonderful things, just in closing, I want to say about these papers is that each one of them, you got a sense of this over the last few minutes, does a great job of bringing out the immediacy of these stories. So we have these conversations, we have these very intimate stories of the experience, whether it's in the halls of the Duma, whether it's on the steppe. We have incredible visual material that we only got a glimpse of here as well, but we get to see the faces and the shoelaces of the people who are involved in these stories. And that kind of visceral sense of history comes out really beautifully in these papers, and it's one of the reasons I would like to thank you all for writing them. So thank you.
Спасибо, Келли, за чудесные вопросы. Давайте сначала дадим возможность ответить, и потом все смогут задать свои вопросы. В порядке очереди.
Okay, I'll try to be very short. So you asked two questions. One is there a sort of Polish narrative of the steppe? I have a great quotation from Januszkiewicz to his friend Zielinski. Zielinski, he was in the steppe, but only for about 5 years. He went back to Warsaw, and he wanted to write poems about Kazakhs. His first poem was actually called Kyrgyz. It was about the Kazakhs, and his next poem was called Steppe. These were poemi, not like little poems, but like epic poems. He sent his poem back to Januszkiewicz, who was still in the steppe, and Januszkiewicz answered him, "You've gone crazy. You think the steppe of the Tamerlanes is Arcadia, a country of green meadows, of flowing streams, an ideal. No, our steppe is not that way. As you see it, it has its beauty, but its own. Wildness, infertility, lack of water, these are its main traits." And then he goes on to say, if you want to know about the steppe, you should read Levshin. And then you'll learn everything you need to know about the steppe. So yes, the idea of the steppe is very clear in all this exile literature. And I would say, if you want to talk about creation of national community, the basic idea of the Polish national community in the 19th century is exile. We are the people who get exiled. We are the people who are cruelly sent to Siberia. It's us who, and there are paintings of this that could show you, there's a really dramatic painting of Polish exiles gathered to be sent off. And so this idea of Polishness as the people who suffer for freedom and justice and truth and all these things, this is integral to the nation building project, and arguably one of the things that helps hold it together. Now, on the question of how Kazakhs saw Poles, I really, really hoped that this story about Joseph Herbert and Kenesari was true. I really wanted to find, and I have looked at all sorts of collections about this. I've read tons of imperial documents hoping to find that something like this really happened. And honestly, it didn't really happen. And as far as I can tell, Poles were just other European colonizers. They were there, they were representing the empire. They were fulfilling the same tasks. I don't think there would be easy to see much of a difference. I don't see how you could see much of a difference. So this is something actually I'm investigating. Maybe later I'll see if it shows up in some kind of Kazakh newspapers or something. But so far as I can tell, the idea that Poles are different from Russian is something that defines Poles. It's not. It doesn't define the way that people see Poles.
Ivan?
Thank you very much for the comments and the questions. Starting with the first question, I think the most important part is that the Duma created a standard discourse about the ways that this Russian imperial nation in the making could be described. Because you have, yes, indeed, you have some intellectuals there and a lot of legal scholars who already wrote something about that. But you also have people coming from the peripheries who have these specific problems. For example, they have the enroachment of peasants from Central Russia. And then they get their vocabulary, how to talk about kind of the possible solution to that. And they also kind of see that their specific problem is part of a bigger problem, right, of the existing inequalities and so on. So at the same time, the State Duma was a body of state power. It was supposedly legislative authority, so it gave this discourse and these ideas legitimacy. So everything which was said in the Duma was not simply another newspaper article or something like that. It was something that the state kind of accepted as legitimate, right? That's probably one of the reasons why the first two Dumas were disbanded so quickly. And of course, it kind of contributed to the further amplification of the discourse through newspapers, because the first two Dumas were under very close public attention. So all in all, the discussions in the first two Dumas set the stage for further developments. So they created a standard discourse about kind of an inclusionary Russian imperial nation that survived over the so-called years of reaction. And in the third and fourth Duma, a lot of people occasionally returned to it, and they didn't have to debate things like that. So this idea of inclusionary Russian nation was already there. So it was quite important, as I mentioned, in the Russian Revolution, and ultimately the failure of this project, its inability to survive in the context of the First World War, and the economic hardships of the revolution kind of led to the Russian Civil War, where particularistic discourses prevailed, right, based on class and individual nationalities. And very, very shortly on the second question, I think that the participants of the debates are indeed trying to grasp kind of the outer boundary of the Russian nation, right? So we have the right-wing Russian nationalists in the second Duma who very often are German in ethnic sense, right? So for them, it's somewhat a problem to find themselves even in the narrow understanding of the Russian nation, even though they say that it should exclude, like the Caucasus, for example, or Siberia, but they themselves, have the problem there because many of them are German. But I think that for the majority, the parliament itself creates the boundary. So by the very inclusion of the peripheries into the parliament, the bureaucrats of the empire offered a very broad definition of this Russian nation. And then this exchange between the Russian parliament and the Finnish parliament, I think, provides a very good illustration that from the side of the Russian parliament, this is where the boundary lies. So Finland is somewhat excluded from this bigger community because it's simply not in the Duma, not in the parliament. Thank you.
Thank you, man. And Alen?
Well, thank you for the great questions. Yeah, of course, during the Virgin Land campaign, the appeal of specific identity to which people belong, well, they were claiming to belong, was Tselenniki. And they were quite proud to be considered as a Tselenniki. Up until now, people remember this, the word, this community, and they still keep repeating themselves that they are Tselenniki, the first Tselenniki. They were the builders, discourse that they were building this region. However, in terms of journalists, I think it's a bit more complex. category of people, because in many respects they are the creators of this discourse of identity of Tselenniki. They are those people who are writing the stories. They are the person who decides what kind of story to publish and not to publish. In many respects, they are creating the stories, the letters for the Tselenniki themselves. And if we even talk about the authorities, often cases the speeches for the Khrushchev, speeches for the Matskevich, Zhurin, it is the leaders of the Tselenniki Krai. The journalists are writing the speeches for them, and in many respects, the journalists became the so-called dictators of who we can call Tselenniki and whom we cannot call Tselenniki in many respects. So.
Thanks, Alen. Gulmira, would you like to respond?
Да. Спасибо вам большое за ваш вопрос и вопросы. Я хотела бы отметить, действительно, когда Бахтан Каратаев писал о том, что по реформе 1868 года ограничение количества мола мечети, он имел в виду, что волость включает от 1000 до 2000 кибиток, и естественно, что зимний период, это кочевание, как дисперсное состояние, естественно, что казахи как таковые могли не видеть этого молу на эту волость. И вот это ограничение, оно дало совсем, изменило ситуацию, оно дало всплеск. Мы знаем, что кто работает в архиве, особенно в центральном нашем госархиве, с 70-х годов до 19 века начинается процесс увеличения количества прошений на открытие мечети и так далее. И это очень, цифры очень. И второй момент, вот по границам родовых кочевий, да, каждого рода. Когда были созданы волости, аулы, то, естественно, здесь тоже нарушение этих границ. Одна волость могла включать 3 рода. И, естественно, это был толчок для того, чтобы началась избирательная борьба за власть. И эта избирательная борьба за власть способствовала тому, что началось взяточничество, коррупция там, и так далее, и так далее. Это вот очень четко в своей работе Бахтан Каратаев показал. И третье, вот я оцениваю его как работу, как историческое сочинение. Почему? Потому что эта работа основана не только на архивных документах, но и на той литературе, которая была им доступна. И более того, он интервьюирование, мы сейчас говорим, да, что он провел интервьюирование. И это, то есть его выводы основаны на разнообразных источниках, а не на одном источнике. Это на самом деле объективно в той или иной форме. Конечно, есть субъективность в том плане, как он очень эмоциональный человек и эмоционально там пишет, но сам факт, что у него еще более того, что он привел сами документы в своей этой работе, но здесь у него есть минус, это очень такой важный момент, что у него, может, не всегда корректно отражены сноски, но сам факт, что у него вот этот исследовательский такой навык был и есть, и это как историка. Почему? Потому что мы даже сейчас знаем, что есть исследователи, которые опираются только на один источник, и это как последняя основная истина, и идет такая мифологизация тогда истории. Я считаю, что да, у него как историческое сочинение.
Спасибо большое, Гульмира, и всем участникам. Теперь у нас есть немного времени буквально на вопросы, и вот я уже вижу первую руку здесь.
Киртис, у меня к вам вопрос. А сколько было поляков и украинцев, собственно, на территории степи? К каким социальным слоям они относились? Было ли между ними, ну, если это были разные социальные слои, была ли между ними какая-то коммуникация? Это было гомогенное сообщество или гетерогенное? И есть ли разница в отношении к русским и казахам у этих слоев? Спасибо.
Thank you for the question. So this is a question of time. In the period up to 1861, the vast majority of exiles were nobles, almost exclusively nobles, because it was the nobility that participated in the 1830 revolution. And so here we can have Ukrainians, Poles, Lithuanians more or less cooperating with each other because they all come from the same background. There is another group of people, though, actually much larger in number, are déclassé officials, people who had noble status, but as a result of the Bibikov anti-reforms, I would call them. When Bidikov became Governor General of Kiev, Kiev, Volhynia, and Podolia general governorship, he systematically deprived most of the nobility, about 300,000 people, of their noble status until only 30,000 had noble status. The rest of the people had to get a job. And so a lot of them, like Osmolowski, who Pavel Shablay talked about, went to Kazan for education, or they went to the Orenburg Frontier Commission. So in some of the Formularные spiski of the Orenburg Frontier Commission, I counted of, say, 100 officials, 15 were Poles, 1 was in exile. The rest were career officials who came, quote unquote, voluntarily. So we have, and they don't say Pole because, of course, the Russian Empire didn't make that category, but they are Catholic nobles from Vitebsk, from Podolia, from Kiev, from Chernihiv, etc. So it's pretty obvious who they are. After 1861, it's a totally different story. Then you have quote-unquote proletarian exiles, a much larger number, and Akmolinskaya Oblast in particular becomes this massive dumping ground for people. And here, it's a much different story. The people don't have money, they don't have jobs, they're always listed as unemployed, they subside on government stipends. But in terms of their interaction with Kazakhs, I haven't found a difference. I think, if anything, the nobility was better at learning foreign languages just because of better educational opportunities. But the only encounter so far I found in an archive between Poles and Kazakhs is that in 1858, 2 Polish exiles met a Kazakh, and they offered to buy his horse and pay him later. And they took his horse and escaped and never paid him. So this is the.
Thank you, Curtis. Если вы не против, давайте разрешим еще 2 вопроса и потом закроем секцию.
Здравствуйте, Ковязина Камила, исследовательский центр PaperLab. У меня вопрос к Алену. У вас такой доклад очень вдохновляющий, вы прям видно, что вам очень нравится вот эта тема, которую вы исследуете. Но вот у меня возник сразу вопрос. Журналисты приехали для того, чтобы освещать поднятие целины, да, и вы говорите много о том, что они делали критику, что они говорили о том, что есть какие-то проблемы, что они стали какой-то 4-й властью, но при этом мы знаем все, что все-таки поднятие целины продолжалось, даже когда это уже приводило к нарушению, да, земного покрова, вот это, эрозии, да, почвы. То есть можно ли сказать, что были какие-то темы, которые им можно было освещать, которые можно было критиковать, то есть какого-то маленького уровня, что вот плохие условия для жизни, вот у них нет досуга, нет жилья и так далее, а какие-то они не могли поднимать. Или, может быть, они даже пытались поднимать, но это на каком-то уровне уже все-таки цензурировалось. То есть вот это вопрос. Я бы хотела, чтобы, я не знаю, может, вы уже рассматриваете, или просто, может, вам подсказка, просто с этой стороны тоже надо посмотреть.
Можно? Спасибо. Мне просто интересно у молодого исследователя, раз тема связана с его докторским исследованием, мне интересен вопрос, вот грань, что он исследует? Деятельность журналистики или он освещает эпоху того времени? Я сразу в 2 словах выражу свое мнение к этому периоду, называя ее целинной экспансией. А в условиях советского времени абсолютно не было возможности объективно освещать все те проблемы, о которых предыдущий человек задал вопрос, потому что свобода слова декларировалась в то время. Поэтому мне интересно, каким образом, что составит суть и содержание вашего диссертационного исследования. Спасибо.
Мне бы хотелось тоже вам задать вопрос. Очень интересное выступление. Тема очень интересная. Первый вопрос мне хотелось бы спросить у вас. Во-первых, вот вы говорили, что журналисты, которые приехали из Москвы, учились, приехали освещать целину и так далее, да? Но вот такой вопрос. Скажите, пожалуйста, А вот воспоминания вот этих журналистов вот в печати, только плохое было, вот что условия там нет, плохо живут и так далее, или были какие-то хорошие моменты тоже, ну, я не знаю, там повседневной жизни целинников, да, не только же в черном цвете, наверное, это все было. Это первый вопрос. И второй вопрос меня интересует, а вот столько целинных журналистов приехало, можно я так скажу, целинных журналистов, и остались они здесь или они как бы провели это все и уехали. Вообще судьбы этих журналистов тоже интересно. Вот в этих воспоминаниях хорошего много или нет? Вот тоже мне интересно.
Хорошо, я начну.
Я понимаю, много вопросов, постарайся, пожалуйста, за 2 минуты.
Хорошо, постараюсь. Ну, собственно, как я уже говорил, я в начале своего исследования, я только начинаю, во многом мне предстоит работа в Кокшетавском архиве, но да, во многом я не хочу исследовать, сколько миллионов пудов зерна было произведено. Это меня не интересует. Меня больше интересует повседневность целинников, как они видели свою роль, что они хотели построить, какие у них были мечты. И, в общем, это такое позитивное исследование. И, несмотря на то, что я сфокусировался на случае коррупции и тому подобное, многие были очень настроены оптимистичны. Даже после, сколько лет прошло, 70 лет прошло, они все еще остаются оптимистичными по поводу своей цели, своей миссии. Несмотря на сложные ситуации, то, что многие по приезду, у них не было где жить, у них не было доступа к воде, к другим благам цивилизации, к благам. Они все равно тепло отзываются об этом experience, они говорят то, что они рады, то, что прошли эту школу. Но это журналисты, да. С случаем с самими людьми, которые работали в совхозе, там немножко все сложнее, но тем не менее большинство из них все еще живут здесь. Если журналисты, если смотрю на журналистов, большинство из них продолжили карьеру спустя 9 лет в Москве. Газеты «Молодой целинник» и «Целинный край» были закрыты в 1965 году, и многие из них расформировались, некоторые пошли работать в «Целинную правду», некоторые пошли на республиканский уровень, но многие решили вернуться в Россию. Или в Украину. Да, были ограничения того, чего они не могли, о чем они не могли писать. К примеру, я уже не помню имя журналиста, он опубликовал целую схему, коррупционную схему на республиканском уровне о том, что многие люди были связаны с коррупцией, и этого человека, освободили от должности, но при этом он остался на свободе, и он пытался добиться справедливости, он пытался устроиться обратно в газете, он писал заявления и в Алмату, и в Москву, и в различные газеты, в том числе «Коммунистическую правду», «Комсомольскую правду», извините. Но он в своих мемуарах говорит, что его как будто закэнцели, как будто его письма не писали, они игнорировались. Так что да, конечно, ограничения были.
Спасибо, Ален. И мне кажется, заканчиваем, да? Разрешите, пожалуйста, закончить и закрыть официально эту сессию. И, конечно, можно продолжить дальше.